Harappan civilization. You stand in what was once the bustling heart of Harappa. The year is 1800, before the Common Era. The streets around you stretch in perfect grids, standardized bricks, sophisticated sewage systems, multi-story homes with private wells, but something is wrong. The houses are empty, not ransacked, not burned, simply vacant. 4 million people lived across this empire just decades ago. Now there is only silence. You walk through Mohenjo-daro, the largest of their cities. The Great Bath sits undisturbed, its bitumen-sealed walls still watertight after 4,000 years. The granaries remain organized. The docks show no signs of violence. No bodies in the streets, no hastily abandoned belongings, no evidence of panic. Just the systematic, inexplicable abandonment of one of history's most advanced civilizations. In 1924, British archaeologist Sir John Marshall first uncovered these ruins along the Indus River. His initial reports to the Archaeological Survey of India described urban planning that wouldn't be matched in the region for another 2,000 years. By 1965, over 1,000 Harappan sites had been identified across what is now Pakistan and northwest India. The civilization covered 500,000 square miles larger than Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. Dr. Knoyer of the University of Wisconsin has spent 4 decades studying Harappan artifacts. His 1998 monograph, Ancient Cities of the Indus Valley Civilization, documented the most sophisticated urban infrastructure of the Bronze Age. Every city followed identical planning principles. Streets ran north-south and east-west in perfect alignment. Standardized weights and measures appeared across the entire empire. Even the bricks followed a precise 4 to 2 to 1 ratio of length to width to height. The Harappans developed the world's first known sewerage system. Every house connected to covered drains that ran beneath the streets. They built docks capable of handling ocean-going vessels. Their artisans created jewelry and textiles that reached markets in Mesopotamia and Central Asia. Archaeological evidence shows a complex economy with specialized craftsmen, long-distance trade networks, and centralized authority. Then, around 1900, before the Common Era, it all stopped. The mainstream explanation points to climate change. Dr. Rita Wright of New York University published findings in 2010 showing evidence of reduced monsoon activity around this period. The Indus River system may have begun shifting course, making agriculture difficult. Population pressure combined with environmental stress could have forced gradual abandonment of the cities. But the evidence doesn't support gradual abandonment. Harappan sites show no transitional period, no reduced construction quality, no signs of social breakdown or conflict. The latest archaeological layers contain the same high-quality artifacts and urban planning as earlier periods. Dr. Possel's 2002 comprehensive survey, The Indus Civilization, A Contemporary Perspective, found that Harappan cities maintained their sophisticated infrastructure right up until abandonment. Most tellingly, the Harappans left behind no warfare evidence whatsoever, no weapons caches, no fortifications, no signs of invasion or conquest. Site after site shows the same pattern: systematic evacuation without violence, environmental disaster, or social collapse. Some researchers suggest the civilization may have faced a sudden catastrophic event that left no archaeological trace. Others propose that Harappan society was so well organized that they managed a coordinated migration when conditions became untenable. But no destination has ever been identified for 4 million displaced people. The Harappan script remains undeciphered, despite hundreds of attempts. Without written records, we cannot know what the Harappans themselves understood about their situation. We can only read the physical evidence they left behind: empty cities that functioned perfectly until the day they were abandoned. What kind of event causes 4 million people to leave simultaneously without fighting? How does an empire covering 500,000 square miles coordinate complete evacuation? Why would the most advanced Bronze Age civilization abandon cities that still function perfectly? Where did they go, and why has no trace of their destination ever been found? The Harappans represent the first great mystery of civilization itself. The question of how complex societies can simply cease to exist without apparent cause, leaving only their empty achievements behind to puzzle future generations who would encounter similar inexplicable endings across the ancient world. Mycenaean Greece. You smell smoke drifting through the corridors of Pylos Palace. The scribe beside you sets down his stylus mid-word, leaving the linear B tablet unfinished on the clay table. Outside, voices are shouting in the courtyard, but they're not the usual commands of palace guards or merchants haggling over bronze ingots. These voices carry panic, fear. You watch the scribe's hands shake as he reaches for another tablet, then stops. He knows what you know. Whatever is happening outside these walls, there will be no more record keeping. No more inventories of sheep and chariots. No more carefully preserved accounts of tribute and trade. This is the end of the only world you've ever known. The collapse of Mycenaean Greece around 1200 before the Common Era remains one of archaeology's most devastating puzzles. Dr. Cynthia Shelmerdine of the University of Texas documented the evidence in her 1997 publication, The Palatial Bronze Age of the Southern and Central Greek Mainland. The linear B tablets from Pylos, discovered by Carl Blegan in 1952, contain the final administrative records of the palace. These tablets were baked hard by the fires that consumed the building, preserving the last bureaucratic acts of a dying civilization. Professor John Chadwick's analysis in the Mycenaean World, published in 1976, revealed that many tablets were left unfinished, as if the scribes simply walked away from their work mid-sentence. The archaeological evidence paints a picture of catastrophic collapse. Professor Oliver Dickinson's surveys, published in The Aegean Bronze Age in 1994, show that the population of Greece dropped by approximately 90% between 1300 and 1100 before the Common Era. Massive fortification projects at Tiryns and Mycenae were abandoned half complete, with stone blocks left precisely where workers had placed them. The citadel at Gla, covering 24 acres with cyclopean walls, was deserted so suddenly that archaeologists found pottery still sitting on tables, tools left exactly where craftsmen had set them down. Dr. Spyros Iakovitidis' excavations at Mycenae, detailed in his 2001 work Gla and the Kopaias in the 13th century before the Common Era, revealed something even more unsettling. The palace archives show meticulous record keeping, right up until the final tablets. These weren't the records of a civilization in decline. They documented thriving trade networks, complex bureaucracies, and major construction projects. The last linear B tablet from Pylos records the deployment of rowers to coastal positions, suggesting the Mycenaeans saw some threat approaching by sea. But whatever came, it came so swiftly that the deployment was never completed. Here's what makes this collapse impossible to explain with conventional theories. Professor Eric Klein's comprehensive study, 1492 before the Common Era, the year civilization collapsed, published in 2014, demonstrates that the destruction wasn't gradual. Carbon dating from multiple sites shows the abandonment happened within a single generation, possibly within a single decade. More disturbing is what didn't happen. There's no evidence of conquest, no foreign pottery or weapons left behind by invaders, no mass graves suggesting plague or warfare. The people simply vanished. The mainstream explanation points to the Bronze Age collapse as a period of general upheaval across the Eastern Mediterranean. The standard archaeological interpretation suggests a combination of factors: invasions by the mysterious sea peoples, internal warfare between Mycenaean kingdoms, climate change that disrupted agriculture, and the breakdown of international trade networks. Professor Robert Drews argued in The End of the Bronze Age, published in 1993, that changes in military technology gave advantage to less centralized societies, making the palace-centered Mycenaean system obsolete overnight. But the timeline doesn't support gradual collapse. Dr. Shelley Waxman's maritime archaeological work, published in Seagoing Ships and Seamanship in the Bronze Age Levant in 1998, shows that Mediterranean trade networks were functioning normally right up until 1200 before the Common Era. The Ulubrun shipwreck, dated to precisely this period, carried cargo from across the known world, suggesting no widespread disruption to commerce. More puzzling, The Linear B tablets show the Mycenaeans were aware of external threats and actively preparing defenses. These weren't caught off guard by gradual decline. They saw something coming and mobilized to meet it. Some researchers suggest the collapse was too rapid and complete for conventional explanations. Professor Susan Sherratt's work in the Mediterranean economy, Globalization at the end of the second millennium before the Common Era, proposes that the Mycenaean kingdoms were so interconnected that the failure of one critical node brought down the entire system within months. Others point to evidence of massive earthquakes, volcanic activity, or even astronomical events that could have disrupted the delicate balance of Bronze Age civilization. The silence of the Linear B tablets offers no answers. After 1200 before the Common Era, Greece entered what historians call the Dark Ages, a period of illiteracy that lasted 3 centuries. The very script that recorded Mycenaean civilization was forgotten so completely that it wasn't deciphered until 1952. What kind of catastrophe makes an entire civilization abandon its cities within a single generation? Why did the survivors never return to the great palaces their ancestors built? How does a complex bureaucratic state simply cease to exist overnight, leaving no explanation in its final records? What were those rowers being deployed to face that never made it into the last tablet from Pylos? Can a civilization that sophisticated really vanish without leaving any account of its own ending? Far to the east, in the jungles of Cambodia, another empire was learning that even the greatest civilizations can disappear when the world shifts beneath them. Khmer Empire. You stand at the edge of what was once the world's largest city. The year is 1432. Yesterday, 1 million people called this place home. Today, the silence stretches across 800 square miles of empty stone. The temple spires of Angkor Wat pierce the canopy like fingers of a buried giant. But the streets that once thundered with merchants, soldiers, and farmers lie already claimed by jungle vines. The great reservoirs that fed this metropolis still hold water, but no one comes to drink. The abandonment of Angkor represents one of history's most spectacular vanishing acts. Dr. Damien Evans of the École Française d'Extrême-Orient used LiDAR technology in 2012 to map the full extent of what researchers now call the Greater Angkor region. His findings, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, revealed an urban complex covering 4,700 square miles, larger than modern Los Angeles. French archaeologist Henri Parmentier documented the site's condition in 1898, finding entire districts swallowed by forest growth that suggested rapid, not gradual, abandonment. The Khmer Empire had dominated Southeast Asia for 6 centuries. At its peak under Jayavarman VII in the late 1200s, it controlled territory from modern Myanmar to Vietnam. The capital at Angkor housed between 750,000 and 1 million inhabitants, making it the largest pre-industrial city in human history. The empire's hydraulic engineering achievements included a network of canals, reservoirs, and rice paddies that supported this massive population through sophisticated water management systems that Harvard archaeologist Roland Fletcher calls the most extensive urban water management system in the pre-industrial world. Then, in 1431, it ended. The mainstream explanation points to a confluence of environmental and political pressures. Climate data from tree rings and lake sediments suggest the region experienced severe droughts in the early 15th century, followed by devastating floods. Dr. Brendan Buckley of Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory published evidence in 2010 showing a 40-year period of drought beginning around 1360, followed by erratic monsoon patterns. Simultaneously, the rising Thai kingdom of Ayutthaya applied military pressure from the west, besieging Angkor multiple times in the 1400s. The theory suggests environmental stress weakened the empire's agricultural foundation, while military threats made the massive capital impossible to defend. But the environmental explanation cannot account for the completeness of the abandonment. Climate stress affects agricultural output gradually. Populations adapt, migrate in waves, or die off over generations. Archaeological evidence shows Angkor's abandonment was sudden and total. Dr. Michael Coe of Yale University noted that the site contains no evidence of gradual decline, no intermediate period of reduced occupation, no signs that people slowly drifted away. Personal belongings remained scattered through empty houses. Temple construction projects were left half-finished, with carved stones abandoned mid-assembly. More puzzling is the absence of records. The Khmer maintained extensive inscriptions on stone stelae throughout their empire, documenting everything from temple dedications to royal genealogies. Yet not a single inscription explains or even mentions the abandonment of their greatest city. The royal chronicles that might have recorded the decision to relocate were written on palm leaves and bamboo, materials that decompose in tropical climates. This leaves historians with 6 centuries of detailed records that simply stop, as if the entire administrative apparatus vanished overnight. Some researchers suggest the abandonment was a planned relocation rather than a collapse. The Khmer court moved the capital southeast to Phnom Penh, establishing what became the post-Angkor period. Dr. Michael Vickery of the Royal University of Fine Arts in Phnom Penh argues this represents strategic adaptation to changing trade patterns and military realities rather than civilizational failure. The empire continued for centuries after Angkor's abandonment, albeit in reduced form. Yet this explanation raises its own questions. Why abandon the most sophisticated urban infrastructure in Southeast Asia? The canal systems and reservoirs of Angkor represented centuries of engineering investment. The temples held religious significance that had defined Khmer identity since the 9th century. Population centers of nearly 1 million people don't relocate without massive logistical coordination. Yet no records document such planning. The jungle has spent 6 centuries reclaiming Angkor, but it guards its secrets well. Temple walls bear no explanations. The great reservoirs reflect only sky. Even the stones themselves offer no testimony to why the heart of an empire suddenly stopped beating. How does a civilization that built the world's largest religious complex simply walk away from it all? What threat could be so immediate that 1 million people would abandon their entire world overnight? If the relocation was planned, why leave no record of the decision that ended 6 centuries of imperial glory? What did they know that we have forgotten? High in the Andes, another empire would soon face its own mysterious end, leaving behind questions carved in stone at 14,000 feet above sea level. Tiwanaku. You stand at 13,000 feet above sea level, lungs burning in the thin Andean air. Before you stretches what should be impossible, perfectly fitted stone blocks, some weighing over 100 tons, arranged with mathematical precision around a ceremonial complex that dwarfs anything the Incas would build centuries later. The silence is absolute except for the wind across Lake Titicaca. No machinery exists that could have moved these stones. No roads lead here capable of supporting such weight. Yet here they stand, abandoned for a millennium, offering no explanation for how 500,000 people simply vanished without a trace. The Tiwanaku civilization, centered in modern-day Bolivia, reached its zenith around 800 Common Era and collapsed by 1050 Common Era. Dr. Alan Collada of the University of Chicago, in his 1993 publication, The Tiwanaku, Portrait of an Andean Civilization, documented a sophisticated empire that controlled trade routes across the Andes for over 700 years. Archaeological evidence reveals a population of approximately 500,000 people, sustained at an altitude where most modern visitors require oxygen assistance. The Akapana Pyramid, standing over 50 feet tall, demonstrates construction techniques that required moving andesite blocks, weighing up to 130 tons across distances of over 10 miles from the nearest quarry. The precision of Tiwanaku stonework rivals anything found in the ancient world. Archaeologist Jean-Pierre Protzen, in his 2004 study published in the Journal of Archaeological Science, measured tolerances between stone blocks accurate to within 2 millimeters. The famous Gateway of the Sun, carved from a single block of andesite weighing approximately 10 tons, displays astronomical alignments that track solstices and equinoxes with mathematical accuracy. Underground drainage systems, discovered through ground-penetrating radar surveys, led by Dr. Alexey Vranich in 2009, reveal hydraulic engineering that prevented flooding across the entire ceremonial complex. Here's what makes this impossible. No civilization at this altitude should have been able to sustain such a large population, let alone construct monuments requiring advanced engineering. The oxygen levels at 13,000 feet are 60% of those at sea level. Modern La Paz, Bolivia's capital at a similar altitude, supports its population only through constant supply lines from lower elevations. Yet, Tiwanaku thrived for centuries with no evidence of such support networks. The mainstream explanation centers on environmental adaptation and agricultural innovation. Researchers point to the waru-waru system of raised fields that maximize crop yields in the harsh altiplano environment. These artificial islands, surrounded by water channels, created microclimates that protected crops from frost while improving soil drainage. Carbon dating of agricultural terraces confirms intensive farming from 600 to 1000 Common Era. The theory suggests that climate change around 1000 Common Era disrupted this delicate agricultural balance, forcing mass abandonment as the civilization could no longer feed itself. But the archaeological evidence tells a different story. No signs of warfare, invasion, or violent destruction mark Tiwanaku's end. Dr. David Brauman's 2007 excavations found no burned structures, no mass graves, no evidence of siege or conquest. The site shows clear signs of deliberate abandonment rather than catastrophic collapse. Tools, pottery, and valuable objects were carefully removed. Buildings were sealed and covered with earth in what appears to be a planned withdrawal. Most puzzling, the raised field systems that supposedly failed due to climate change continue to function effectively. Modern reconstructions of waru-waru fields in the same region produce crops successfully today, suggesting that environmental collapse cannot fully explain the abandonment. Carbon isotope analysis of human remains, conducted by Dr. Christine White in 2011, reveals that Tiwanaku's population maintained consistent nutrition levels right up to the abandonment period. No evidence of famine, disease, or environmental stress appears in the skeletal record. The empire's extensive trade networks, which brought coca leaves from the Amazon and copper from Chile, show no signs of disruption in the decades leading to 1000 Common Era. Some researchers suggest that internal political fragmentation led to voluntary dispersal, but this fails to explain why such a successful civilization would abandon their sacred center and engineering marvels. The stone blocks themselves present their own mystery. Modern attempts to move similar weights at this altitude have required helicopter transport. The nearest source quarries lie across terrain that would challenge contemporary heavy machinery. Yet Tiwanaku's builders somehow transported and precisely placed hundreds of these massive stones without leaving evidence of the ramps, rollers, or infrastructure such an undertaking would require. Why would 500,000 people abandon a city that had sustained them for 7 centuries? How did they move 100-ton stones to 13,000 feet without modern technology? What force could make an entire civilization simply walk away from their sacred center? Where did they go, leaving no trace in the archaeological record of their new settlements? Why seal and bury their monuments if they expected to return? The mystery of Tiwanaku's abandonment would echo across continents, where another great empire's sudden silence would leave equally baffling questions in the highlands of East Africa. Axumite Empire. You smell frankincense burning in the morning air. Gold coins catch sunlight in your palm. Roman aureus, Persian drachma, your own Axumite currency bearing King Ezana's cross. The year is 958 Common Era. You stand in the shadow of the great obelisk of Axum, 79 feet of carved granite pointing toward heaven. Merchants speak in a dozen languages around you. Caravans stretch toward the horizon carrying ivory and silk between Rome and India. This is the beating heart of Red Sea commerce. 2 years later, the caravan stopped coming. The Axumite Empire controlled the most lucrative trade routes in the ancient world for 8 centuries. Founded in the 1st century Common Era in what is now northern Ethiopia, Axum became the 3rd great power alongside Rome and Persia. Stuart Munro Hay's comprehensive study, Axum, an African civilization of late antiquity published in 1991, documents how Axumite merchants operated ports from modern-day Sudan to Somalia. Their gold, silver, and bronze coins have been discovered in archaeological sites from Britain to Sri Lanka. The empire's granite obelisks, some weighing over 500 tons, demonstrate engineering capabilities that rival any civilization of their era. King Caleb's military campaigns against the Himyarite kingdom of Yemen in 525 Common Era established Axumite dominance across the Red Sea. Byzantine historian Procopius recorded Axumite ambassadors at the court of Emperor Justinian in 532 Common Era. The empire minted coins with Greek, Ge'ez, and Arabic inscriptions, reflecting their cosmopolitan reach. Archaeological evidence from Beta Georgis site shows continuous urban development, monumental construction, and international trade activity through the early 10th century. Then everything stops. Abruptly. Completely. Rodolfo Fadovich's excavations at Axum, published in the Journal of African Archaeology in 2009, reveal a stark chronological break around 960 Common Era. Construction ceases mid-project. The capital is gradually abandoned, no more coins are minted, international trade networks that operated for 8 centuries vanish from the archaeological record. Most telling, the empire disappears from contemporary chronicles. Arab geographers who regularly mentioned Axum in the 9th century make no reference to it after 970 Common Era. The mainstream explanation centers on the rise of Islamic maritime trade. Historians argue that Muslim merchants bypassed Axumite middlemen by establishing direct trade routes through the Persian Gulf and Indian Ocean. Economic pressure from Arab expansion allegedly forced the empire into decline. Climate change may have contributed, as paleoclimatic data suggests increased aridity in the Horn of Africa during the 10th century. Political fragmentation supposedly followed economic collapse. But the archaeological evidence suggests something far more sudden than gradual decline. David Phillipson's excavations, detailed in his 2012 publication, Foundations of an African Civilization, reveal that major construction projects were abandoned halfway through completion. Tools were left in place. Partially carved obelisks remain exactly where workers stopped. This doesn't indicate slow economic decline, it suggests immediate evacuation. The empire's military remained powerful through the mid-10th century. Axumite forces successfully defended against Arab incursions as late as 940 Common Era. Their navy continued operating Red Sea routes. Most puzzling, the archaeological record shows no evidence of conquest, invasion, or internal warfare around 960 Common Era. No destruction layers, no burned buildings, no mass graves. The capital was simply abandoned by people who had every reason to stay. Recent isotope analysis of burial remains by Andrea Manzo, published in African Archaeological Review in 2019, reveals something even stranger. The Axumite population didn't just abandon their capital, they disappeared entirely from the archaeological record. No migration patterns, no secondary settlements. 8 centuries of one of Africa's most sophisticated civilizations simply vanished. What could force an empire controlling the most profitable trade routes in the world to abandon everything overnight? Why would a military power capable of projecting force across the Red Sea flee without a fight? How does an entire population disappear so completely that they leave no archaeological trace? Where did 800 years of accumulated wealth, knowledge, and cultural memory go? Why did contemporary chroniclers stop mentioning them as if they had never existed? But perhaps the most unsettling disappearance was yet to come, in a place where massive earthen pyramids would rise and fall along the banks of the Mississippi River. Mississippian culture. You climb the final earthen steps as dawn breaks over the American continent. The year is 1350, Common Era. Below you stretches a city that would make Rome weep with envy. 20,000 souls move through plazas wider than European cathedrals. The pyramid beneath your feet rises 100 feet into the sky, its base covering 14 acres larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Cahokia pulses with life. Trade routes stretch from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, copper from Michigan, shells from Florida, obsidian from the Rocky Mountains. This is the beating heart of a civilization. You cannot know that in 50 years, it will all be gone. The Mississippian culture emerged around 800 Common Era and reached its zenith by 1100. Dr. Timothy Pocketot of the University of Illinois documented the scope in his 2009 work Cahokia, Ancient America's Great City on the Mississippi. The civilization wasn't just Cahokia. It was a network of interconnected cities and ceremonial centers spanning from present-day Minnesota to Louisiana, from Oklahoma to North Carolina. Archaeological surveys conducted by the Cahokia Mounds State Historic Site have identified over 100 mounds at the Illinois location alone, with residential areas extending across 6 square miles. The precision of their urban planning staggers modern engineers. Grand Plaza covers 40 acres, flattened and maintained to tolerances measured in inches. Dr. Sarah Bears of Eastern Connecticut State University published radiocarbon dating in 2014, showing the plaza was resurfaced multiple times, each layer precisely leveled. The astronomical alignments rival Stonehenge Monk's Mound's corners align with the cardinal directions to within degrees. Woodhenge, their solar calendar, tracked solstices and equinoxes with mathematical precision that wouldn't be matched in North America until European arrival. Population estimates by Dr. George Milner of Pennsylvania State University, published in American Antiquity in 2013, place Cahokia's peak population between 10,000 and 20,000 residents, larger than London at the time. The supporting agricultural system irrigated thousands of acres. Fish weirs in the Mississippi channeled massive harvests. Storage facilities could feed the population through multiple harsh winters. Then, around 1400 Common Era, the entire network collapsed. Not just Cahokia. Every major Mississippian center, from Moundville in Alabama to Astalon in Wisconsin, simultaneously, uniformly, completely. The mainstream explanation centers on environmental and social stress. Climate data from ice cores shows the medieval warm period ending around 1300, bringing cooler temperatures and shorter growing seasons. Dr. Larry Benson's paleoclimate research, published in Quaternary Science Reviews in 2013, documents severe drought conditions across the Midwest during the 14th century. Overpopulation may have strained resources beyond sustainability. Political fragmentation followed environmental collapse, leading to warfare and abandonment. But the timeline doesn't support gradual decline. Radiocarbon dating shows active construction and intensive occupation right up until 1400. No evidence of siege, no burn layers indicating warfare. No gradual population decrease that environmental stress should produce. Dr. Susan Alt of Indiana University documented in her 2017 analysis that corn production actually increased in the decades before abandonment. Storage facilities were full, trade networks functioned normally. The uniformity across the network defies explanation. How does an environmental collapse affect regions with different climates simultaneously? Moundville in Alabama enjoyed different weather patterns than Cahokia in Illinois, yet both were abandoned within the same narrow time frame. No European diseases had yet reached the continent. Columbus wouldn't arrive for another 92 years. No documented warfare between major centers. No evidence of internal rebellion or social collapse. Some researchers suggest a coordinated religious or cultural decision, a mass exodus based on prophecy or astronomical events. Others propose an unknown pandemic that left no skeletal evidence, but devastated populations uniformly across the network. The absence of human remains from the final occupation phases hints at deliberate abandonment rather than catastrophic death. Archaeological evidence from post-abandonment phases shows something equally puzzling. Later, Native American groups avoided the sites entirely. Not just Cahokia, but the entire network of ceremonial centers remained untouched for generations. Local tribes possessed oral traditions, warning against the abandoned mounds, but no explanations for why they were left empty. Why would 20,000 people abandon the largest city north of Mexico? How does an entire civilization network collapse uniformly across thousands of miles? What kind of crisis leaves storage facilities full and construction projects half finished? Why did later peoples avoid these sites for centuries? What did they know that we don't? An ocean away, another maritime empire was facing its own mysterious end, though the Mediterranean would keep its secrets buried beneath different waters. Minoan civilization. You stand in the Grand Central Court of Knossos. The year is 1449 before the Common Era. Multi-story palaces stretch in every direction. Frescoes of bull leapers and dolphins dance across plastered walls. Water flows through sophisticated drainage systems beneath your feet. Somewhere in the administrative quarters, Scribes scratch linear A symbols onto clay tablets, a writing system as complex as any in the Mediterranean. The Minoan fleet controls trade routes from Spain to the Levant. This is Europe's first civilization, a Bronze Age empire that invented flush toilets while most of the continent lived in mud huts. Tomorrow, it will all be gone. Not conquered, not gradually declined. Gone. The disappearance was so complete that when British archaeologist Sir Arthur Evans first excavated Knossos in 1900, he had to invent the name Minoan after the legendary King Minos. No one knew what the people called themselves. Professor Sinclair Hood of the British School at Athens documented in The Minoans, Crete in the Bronze Age, published in 1971, that every major Minoan site across Crete shows evidence of sudden abandonment around 1450 before the Common Era. Dr. Gerald Cadogan's excavations at Zakros, published in Palaces of Minoan Crete in 1976, revealed food still cooking in palace kitchens when disaster struck. The bread was left to burn. What makes this vanishing impossible to explain is the totality. The Minoans left behind over 3,000 linear A tablets. Yet despite decades of attempts by linguists, including Dr. John Chadwick, who successfully deciphered linear B, not a single linear A text has been translated. Dr. Gareth Owens of the Technological Educational Institute of Crete has identified recurring word patterns suggesting religious or administrative content, but the language family remains unknown. The script appears to record a language unrelated to any known Mediterranean tongue. The archaeological evidence defies conventional collapse patterns. Dr. Keith Brannigan's survey work, documented in the Foundations of Palatial Crete from 1970, shows that Minoan sites weren't burned by invaders or abandoned due to economic decline. Palace magazines remained full of grain and oil. Sacred horns of consecration stood undisturbed in courtyards. The famous snake goddess figurines were left in their shrines. If the population fled some disaster, they left everything behind. The mainstream explanation centers on natural catastrophe. The volcanic eruption of Thera, modern Santorini, occurred sometime between 1600 and 1500 before the Common Era, sending tsunamis across the Aegean. Dr. Spyridon Marinatos, who excavated Akrotiri on Thera, argued in excavations at Thera from 1968 through 1976 that volcanic ash and seismic destruction weakened Minoan power, allowing Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland to conquer a diminished civilization. But the timeline doesn't support this explanation. Radiocarbon dating by Dr. Sturt Manning of Cornell University, published in A Test of Time in 1999, places the Thera eruption closer to 1600, before the Common Era, a century and a half before the Minoan collapse. The Minoans rebuilt after Thera and continued thriving for generations. Moreover, Dr. Sandy McGillivray's excavations at Policastro, detailed in the Policastro Koros from 1991, show that some sites were deliberately destroyed by human action, with valuable objects smashed rather than looted. The Mycenaean conquest theory faces similar problems. When the Greeks did occupy Crete after 1450, before the Common Era, they used Linear B script to record their own language. But they also preserved Minoan administrative systems and religious practices, suggesting they inherited empty palaces rather than conquering a functioning civilization. Dr. Jan Driessen of the Université Catholique de Louvain argues in The Scribes of the Room of the Chariot Tablets at Knossos from 1990 that the transition period shows no signs of violent takeover. Some researchers suggest internal collapse, perhaps civil war between competing palace centers or a peasant revolt against the elite. Dr. Colin Renfrew proposes in The Emergence of Civilization from 1972 that Minoan society became too complex to sustain itself, leading to systems collapse. But this doesn't explain the simultaneous abandonment across all sites or the preservation of valuables that would have been seized in any internal conflict. The most unsettling aspect remains the silence. Every other Bronze Age civilization left some record of its final days. Assyrian chronicles of Babylon's fall, Egyptian accounts of the Sea Peoples, Mycenaean tales of Troy. The Minoans left nothing. No enemy claimed credit for their defeat. No refugees appear in foreign records. No cultural memory survived, even in Crete itself. Why did Europe's first literate civilization vanish without leaving a single comprehensible word about its fate? How does a maritime empire controlling the Mediterranean simply disappear? What disaster strikes so suddenly that bread burns in ovens, but no one records what happened? Why did the survivors never return to claim treasures left behind in palace storerooms? Where did an entire population go? And why did they take their language with them into oblivion? Far across the Atlantic, another advanced civilization would face its own inexplicable end, leaving behind monumental architecture in the American Southwest. Pueblo Bonito culture. You stand in the shadow of a 4-story sandstone wall. The year is 1129 Common Era. Above you, 600 rooms stretch across the canyon floor, like a perfectly planned metropolis. Children's laughter echoes from courtyards where craftsmen polish turquoise jewelry traded from mines 1,000 miles away. Water flows through engineered channels from distant reservoirs. Roads wider than anything Rome built at its peak radiate outward in perfect straight lines, connecting dozens of communities across 400 miles of high desert. This is Chaco Canyon, at the height of its power, the beating heart of the most sophisticated civilization in North America. Within a single year, it will all be empty. The abandonment of Chaco Canyon represents one of archaeology's most puzzling mass departures. Dr. Stephen Lexon of the University of Colorado Boulder documented the timeline in his 2009 publication, A History of the Ancient Southwest. Between 1129 and 1130 Common Era, an estimated 15,000 people systematically evacuated, not just Pueblo Bonito, but the entire Chacoan network. They left behind perfectly preserved great houses, with walls still standing, 4 stories high, astronomical observatories calibrated to track celestial events decades into the future, and road systems so precisely engineered that modern GPS mapping confirms their accuracy to within meters. The scale of what they abandoned defies comprehension. Pueblo Bonito alone contained over 600 rooms, arranged in a D-shaped complex covering 3 acres. Archaeologist Neil Judd's excavations between 1921 and 1927 revealed rooms stocked with tens of thousands of pieces of turquoise shell jewelry from the Pacific coast and copper bells from Mexico. The University of New Mexico's Thomas Windes calculated that the great houses required over 200,000 trees transported from forests 50 miles away across terrain with no rivers or pack animals. But here's what makes this impossible. They didn't just leave, they systematically sealed doorways, filled in kivas with precisely placed stones, and dismantled portable architectural elements like wooden lintels and roof beams. Dr. Patricia Crown of the University of New Mexico documented this process in her 2014 study, Ritual Drink and Social Change in the Pre-Columbian Southwest. This wasn't an evacuation, it was a methodical decommissioning that required months of coordinated effort. The mainstream explanation points to climate data from tree ring studies. Dr. Jeffrey Dean of the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research established that the region experienced severe drought conditions between 1130 and 1180 Common Era. The theory suggests that declining rainfall made the Chacoan system unsustainable, forcing populations to disperse to areas with more reliable water sources. Archaeological evidence shows increased conflict during this period, with defensive walls appearing at sites that previously had none. But the climate explanation cannot account for the systematic nature of the departure. Drought would produce gradual abandonment, scattered refugee settlements, and clear evidence of resource stress. Instead, Dr. Ruth Van Dyke of Binghamton University documented something unprecedented. The Chacoans dismantled their most sacred spaces with the same precision they used to build them. They removed wooden elements that could have been reused elsewhere, filled ceremonial chambers with carefully selected stones, and sealed doorways using the same masonry techniques employed in original construction. The timing reveals another impossibility. Dendrochronology places the peak of Chacoan construction between 1050 and 1120 Common Era, meaning they built their most ambitious projects during the very climate conditions that supposedly caused their collapse. The Great Kiva at Casa Rinconada, with its perfectly aligned solar and lunar sightlines, was completed just 5 years before the abandonment began. Why would a civilization invest in monumental, astronomical architecture if they knew environmental collapse was imminent? Some researchers suggest the departure was religiously motivated. Dr. Dennis Gilpin of Archaeology Southwest proposed in 2016 that Chacoan society was structured around cyclical beliefs that required periodic abandonment and renewal. The careful sealing of sacred spaces supports this theory. These weren't people fleeing disaster, but fulfilling predetermined spiritual obligations. Other scholars point to evidence of social stratification and suggest internal political collapse drove the systematic evacuation. The most unsettling aspect remains the completeness of their erasure from the historical record. Unlike other ancestral Puebloan groups, the Chacoans left no clear descendant populations who preserved oral traditions about the great houses. Modern Pueblo tribes acknowledge Chaco as ancestral, but retain no specific memories of why it was abandoned or where its people went. What kind of crisis could convince 15,000 people to abandon the most sophisticated infrastructure in North America? Why did they take time to seal sacred spaces if they were fleeing environmental catastrophe? How does an entire civilization simply vanish from cultural memory? Did they know something about their future that we cannot read in their ruins? What were they trying to preserve by destroying their own legacy? The wind through Chaco's empty doorways carries no answers, but across an ocean, another empire was about to face its own inexplicable end. Hittite Empire? You are standing in the throne room of Hattusa. The year is 1179 before the Common Era. The carved lions at the gate still guard an empire that spans from the Aegean to the Euphrates. Tomorrow, this will all be ash. The scribes are fleeing with whatever tablets they can carry. The great library burns. 5 centuries of imperial records turn to smoke in a single night. You are witnessing the death of a superpower so complete that within generations, no one will remember the Hittites ever existed. The collapse was discovered in 1861 when French archaeologist Charles Texier first identified the ruins at Boğazkale, Turkey. What he found defied everything historians thought they knew about the ancient world. German archaeologist Hugo Winkler's excavations from 1906 to 1912 uncovered over 10,000 cuneiform tablets in the royal archives. The decipherment work by Bedřich Hrozný, published in his 1917 study Die Sprache der Hethiter, revealed an empire that had been Egypt's equal. These were the people who fought Ramesses II to a standstill at Kadesh. They controlled the Bosporus, the copper mines of Anatolia, and the trade routes between Europe and Asia. Professor Trevor Bryce's 1998 comprehensive study, The Kingdom of the Hittites, documents the empire's peak around 1250 before the Common Era. The capital at Hattusa covered 413 acres within massive stone walls. The Great Temple Complex alone measured 265 by 213 feet. Archaeological evidence shows a sophisticated administrative system, advanced metallurgy, and diplomatic correspondence with every major power from Babylon to Mycenae. The Hittites were the first civilization to master iron working on an industrial scale. Then, around 1180, before the Common Era, it all ended. The archaeological record shows Hattusa was systematically destroyed by fire. Every major building burned simultaneously. The royal palace, the temples, the administrative buildings, the residential quarters. Professor Aslıhan Yener's 2009 excavations revealed destruction layers containing charcoal, collapsed mud brick, and melted bronze artifacts across every sector of the city. The fire was so intense it vitrified pottery and fused stone blocks. This was not gradual decline. This was apocalyptic destruction in a matter of days. Here's what makes this collapse impossible to explain. There is no evidence of who destroyed the empire or why. No enemy armies are recorded marching on Hattusa. No siege equipment has been found. No mass graves indicate a final battle. The Hittites simply vanished from history so completely that the Assyrians, who inherited their trade routes just decades later, made no mention of them. The Egyptians stopped corresponding with a partner they had treated as an equal for centuries. The diplomatic silence is absolute. The The mainstream explanation points to the broader Bronze Age collapse affecting the Eastern Mediterranean around 1200 before the Common Era. The theory, developed by Robert Drews in his 1993 work, The End of the Bronze Age, suggests invasions by the mysterious sea peoples destabilized trade networks and triggered cascading political failures across the region. Climate change, documented in ice core data by Harvey Weiss and others, shows severe drought conditions that could have caused agricultural collapse and population movements. The Hittites, dependent on tribute from vassal states and international trade, would have been vulnerable to these systemic shocks. But this explanation cannot account for the specific nature of Hattusa's destruction. The Sea Peoples attacked coastal cities. Hattusa was hundreds of miles inland, protected by mountains and forests. The city showed no signs of siege or military assault. The destruction was internal, systematic, and complete. Professor Gojko Barjamovic's 2011 analysis of the tablet archives shows normal administrative activity right up until the final destruction layer. Tax records, legal proceedings, and diplomatic correspondence continue uninterrupted until they simply stop. There was no gradual weakening, no economic crisis, no recorded internal rebellion. One day, there was an empire. The next day, there was silence. Some researchers suggest the Hittites destroyed their own capital in a controlled evacuation, perhaps retreating to secondary strongholds that have yet to be discovered. The systematic nature of the burning, the absence of looting, and the careful removal of certain royal archives support this theory. Others point to possible religious or political revolution, though no Hittite texts record any internal conflicts severe enough to justify the complete abandonment of their homeland. What force could destroy a superpower so thoroughly that it erased itself from history? How do you make 5 centuries of imperial documentation disappear overnight? Why would a people systematically destroy their own capital city? Where did the survivors go that they left no trace in any neighboring civilization's records? What secret was so dangerous it required the complete obliteration of Hittite culture? But the Hittites were not the only civilization to master the art of vanishing completely, leaving behind only questions carved in stone. Great Zimbabwe. You stand at the base of walls that shouldn't exist. Massive granite blocks, each weighing over a ton, fitted together without a single drop of mortar. The stone is warm under your palm, heated by the African sun. Above you, the great enclosure rises 30 feet into the sky, its walls 15 feet thick at the base. The craftsmanship is flawless, every joint perfect, every curve deliberate. But the city is empty, has been empty for over 500 years. 20,000 people lived here once. Now there's only silence and the wind moving through abandoned passages. The ruins sprawl across 1,800 acres of granite hills and valleys in what is now southeastern Zimbabwe. British archaeologist James Theodore Bent first documented the site systematically in 1891, though local Shona people had known of it for generations. His initial reports, published in The Ruined Cities of Mashonaland in 1892, described walls reaching heights of 35 feet in some sections. Later excavations by Gertrude Caton Thompson in 1929, detailed in her The Zimbabwe Culture, revealed sophisticated engineering throughout the complex. The hill complex, perched on a natural granite outcrop, contains the most intricate stonework. The valley complex below housed the majority of the population. Between them, the great enclosure stands as the largest ancient structure south of the Sahara. Radiocarbon dating places the city's peak between 1300 and 1450 Common Era. At its height, Great Zimbabwe controlled gold trade routes stretching from the interior to the Indian Ocean coast. Archaeological evidence shows trade connections reaching as far as China and Persia. Excavations have uncovered Chinese porcelain, Persian glass beads, and Arab coins alongside locally crafted gold ornaments and soapstone birds. The city's inhabitants, ancestors of the modern Shona people, developed sophisticated metallurgy, creating gold jewelry and iron tools of remarkable quality. Here's what makes this impossible. The precision of the stonework rivals medieval European cathedrals, yet it was accomplished without iron tools, wheeled transport, or beast of burden larger than cattle. The walls contain an estimated 1 million granite blocks, each carefully selected and shaped to fit without mortar. Some sections curve in perfect arcs, spanning hundreds of feet. The famous conical tower in the Great Enclosure stands 30 feet tall, built from precisely cut stones that taper flawlessly from base to summit. Archaeologist Peter Garlake, in his 1973 study, Great Zimbabwe, calculated that moving and placing the stones would have required coordinated labor from thousands of workers over multiple generations. But the abandonment tells a different story. Around 1450 Common Era, the inhabitants simply left. No signs of warfare, no evidence of disease, no indication of resource depletion severe enough to force evacuation. The abandonment appears to have been gradual but complete. Archaeological layers show normal daily life continuing right up to the end, with cooking pots, tools, and personal ornaments left in place as if people intended to return. The mainstream explanation points to environmental degradation and shifting trade routes. Climate data suggests the region experienced increasing aridity during the 15th century. Overgrazing and deforestation around the city may have made agriculture unsustainable. Simultaneously, Portuguese traders were establishing coastal trading posts, potentially bypassing Great Zimbabwe's inland routes. The combination of ecological pressure and economic decline would have made the massive stone city impractical to maintain. But this explanation struggles with the timeline and the evidence. The abandonment preceded major Portuguese coastal expansion by decades. Climate records show drought cycles, but nothing more severe than the region had weathered before. More puzzling is the complete nature of the departure. If environmental or economic pressures were gradually making the city unviable, we would expect to see signs of decline. Smaller populations, reduced construction, simplified pottery. Instead, archaeological evidence suggests Great Zimbabwe maintained its full complexity right until abandonment. The final occupation layers contain the same sophisticated crafts, the same imported goods, the same signs of centralized authority as the city's peak period. Some researchers suggest the abandonment was deliberate and coordinated, possibly related to succession disputes or religious changes not visible in the archaeological record. The Shona oral traditions speak of the city being abandoned when the ancestral spirits demanded relocation, but these accounts were recorded centuries after the fact. Portuguese records from the 1600s describe the ruins as already ancient and mysterious to local inhabitants. What force could empty a thriving metropolis of 20,000 people? Why abandon walls that had taken generations to build? What knowledge died with Great Zimbabwe's final inhabitants? How does a civilization simply choose to walk away from its greatest achievement? Where did they go? And why did they never return? The pattern repeats itself across history. Great powers that vanish as suddenly as morning mist, leaving only questions carved in stone. 10 civilizations, 10 different continents, climates, and centuries. 10 different ways of organizing human society, from the bronze-working cities of the Indus Valley to the cliff-dwelling communities of the American Southwest. Yet they share something that should be impossible. They all vanished at the height of their power, leaving behind only stones and silence, where once there were thriving populations, numbering in the hundreds of thousands. The archaeological record shows us palaces abandoned mid-construction, trade networks that simply stopped functioning, and cities evacuated so quickly that people left their most precious possessions behind. No gradual decline, no extended period of warfare or famine that we can trace through layers of destruction, just absence. What we're looking at isn't random historical coincidence. It's a pattern that suggests something fundamental about how complex civilizations actually function, something our models of gradual rise and fall cannot explain. Each of these societies had reached what archaeologists call a complexity threshold. Dense populations, specialized labor, long-distance trade networks, monumental architecture, and sophisticated administrative systems. They had solved the basic problems of human organization. They were succeeding. And then, within what appears to be a single generation, sometimes a single decade, they crossed some invisible line from flourishing to gone. Not conquered, not gradually abandoned, erased. The most unsettling possibility is that we're not looking at 10 separate mysteries, but 10 glimpses of the same phenomenon, something that complex civilizations do, or something that happens to them when they reach a certain critical mass. The pattern suggests there might be natural limits to how complex human societies can become before they trigger their own dissolution. If that's true, then every thriving civilization isn't building toward permanence. It's building toward a threshold it cannot see, a point beyond which the very systems that made it successful become the mechanisms of its disappearance. And we have no idea where that line is, or whether we've already crossed it ourselves.